Welcome to all of you joining us from far and wide for the closing session of our IPBES 8 Stakeholder Days. Thank you also for those who joined us during the opening session and at one of the 3 regional sessions. For me, it's been a real privilege to learn all about the amazing work you're doing to put biodiversity in the spotlight and make sure that it's center stage on the policymakers' agenda in this very important year, with the COP15 on biodiversity and COP26 on climate change taking place. Today, we'll be putting the finishing touches to the ONET and IPBES statements for the plenary session that Miguel and his team of facilitators have been working so hard on since last Wednesday. I would also like now to introduce my co-moderator, Eva Speen. Eva, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Claire. I'm Eva Speen. I am coordinating the Swiss National Platform for IPBES, engaging experts, stakeholders, and policymakers on a national level. And I work at the Swiss Academy of Sciences. So let me introduce you to the housekeeping and how to engage in this session slide. So if you want to hear interpretation, you can click on the little globe symbol and select your favorite language. Then there is a Q&A button just left of it. This is the Q&A box. So if you want to pose a question, please use that box. And please start the name of the speaker to whom you would like to address your question before you enter your question. And then if you want to make a comment, please use the chat function. I also would like to remind you that the session will be recorded and available on YouTube. And the links will be shared on the IPBES website in the Stakeholder Days webpage. And if you are on social media, please tag at IPBES and also use the hashtags hashtag IPBES8, hashtag IPBES stakeholders, and hashtag for nature. So thanks a lot for all of you being here in this final session. And I'd like to hand over to Claire.
Thanks, Eva. Well, Ana Maria Hernandez Salgar, Chair of IPBES, has been with us throughout all of the Stakeholder Days, even joining us at 2 in the morning her time for the Asia Pacific Regional Meeting, which I think more than shows her commitment to the cause. So it's my great pleasure to ask Ana Maria to take the floor for some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Claire, and good morning, good day, afternoon, evening to every one of you. It is my pleasure again to join you during this final day of the Stakeholders Days. And I hope that this is going to be a very fruitful session, final session in preparation for the 8th plenary of IPBES. There is no doubt that are incredible lessons to be learned from the different sources of knowledge coming from you, including the experiences, practices, and also the difficulties and the gaps in generating spaces to translate that valuable data and information you provide into concrete actions and networks, and how to organize this work on conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and nature contributions to people. These 2 weeks meetings have been possible thanks to you, to all the people that is attending these meetings independently of the hour and independently of the region. So thank you very much. And of course, thanks to the stakeholders project team, IUCN, ONET, IIFB, and IPBES team, and all the organizations behind these networks. All of you have created the opportunity for more voices to come together and to channel these contributions to the plenary, which begins on June 14. And as you know, we are running in the preparations of the plenary, but really, it's very important all the contributions and the statements, and more than statements, the ideas and the knowledge that you are going to present next week. Also, I want to thank the interpreters who have been essential, as always they are, so that more people from different parts of the world can participate in this process. All of you, please take this into consideration, are part of the IPBES community. And as part of that IPBES community, are part of the success of this virtual Stakeholders Day. And you are going to be part of the success of the IPBES Plenary. I wish you the best in this final session, and I hope to see you virtually on June 14. Thank you very much, and back to you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria. Well, I was mentioning those 3 regional meetings that we've had over the past few days. If you weren't able to attend one of them, don't worry, because we're now going to get the highlights and headlines from 3 rapporteurs. And let's start with Sarah Banda Genschev, who's now at the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. But as many of you will know, Sarah used to work at the IPBES Secretariat, and she is here today talking to us in her personal capacity. So, Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Claire. So the Stakeholder Days have followed a time-zone-specific approach with 3 events in the last days. Claire has said this already, but I would like to also thank the IPBES chair for her level of commitment and support from all stakeholders. Anna, thank you so much. Anna Maria, thank you so much for being up at 2 a.m. And this level of engagement is highly appreciated. But also I would like to thank the level of engagement from all presenters, the regional co-chairs, regional assessment co-chairs, presenters from the Indigenous and local communities. We've had ONET and IPBES members make presentations, and all the stakeholders that have actually attended the Stakeholder Day in the last days. The sessions have been highly interactive, offering online participants a chance to pose questions to the panelists. A session on insights from IPBES regional assessments with a focus on knowledge, policy, and implementation gaps, addressing ways to motivate efficient decision-making, promote behavioral change, and transition from sectorial to integrated management was presented. We then had another session on engaging with IPBES functions, with a focus on early career researchers from the Young Ecosystem Services Specialists, the Social Scientists and Humanities Network, ONET, and IPBES Fellow, who has participated in the IPBES Fellowship that is managed by the IPBES Capacity Building Technical Support Unit based in Norway. And we heard from the presenters on some of the obstacles faced in finding funding, and also with regards to opportunities for engagement in the science policy interface. But we also heard from the researchers themselves on how they have not been perceived as credible and not encouraged by senior colleagues. So we hope that in the future, this would improve. We have also seen actually from the last Stakeholder Day, the creation of the Social Scientists and Humanities Network. And we hope that more networks get established that also target other stakeholder groups with the hope of strengthening engagement. And having a good example here would be the business network within the ONET umbrella network that would get established. The third session on regional and national platform networks had a focus on capacity building. And here they showcased efforts being made to create capacity in a coordinated manner with options of stakeholder engagement through establishments of networks and platforms. We also saw these platforms that had been created either at the request of a government, and here we have examples of Japan, where the government is involved, Chile, and then we also saw the self-organized platforms with sometimes external funding. And here we have the option of WABES, which is the West African Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is funded by the German government. and they offer a master's degrees program. And we saw also IPBES, which is a Brazilian platform, which is also self-organized. But then we also saw some creation of networks where we had a mix of governments and stakeholders. And here we had examples from Grenada, we had Trinidad and Tobago, and then we had the Swedish Scientific Council for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. One of the takes in the last days have been the need to strengthen the national platforms and network with a call to create sub-regional and regional platforms and networks that would advance the science policy interface, but more so allow for knowledge transfer beyond policymakers. And then the last session was on regional and national platform networks with a focus on the Indigenous people and local community engagement. And I can confirm that this session was very informative as we saw how the Indigenous people and local communities are translating the science and combining it with their knowledge into action. We have seen examples of empowerment of IPRCs. We have seen also results of the work of the Indigenous and local communities that has fed into current assessments like the invasive alien species. And we have also seen how they have used the IPBES assessments, for example, on the pollinators, pollination and food production, and have held dialogues across Indigenous and local communities. And then last but not the least, we have also seen work related to community ecological governance, including reviving Indigenous and local knowledge and practices. And here there's been a lot of input from the Indigenous and local communities on policies within governments. And to end the summary from my end, it's been a very enriching 4 days, and stakeholders have showcased actions and impacts based on the findings of the IPBES assessments. I would like to thank the Stakeholders project team for giving me this opportunity to report back to the meeting on the times on specific sessions, and over to you, Claire.
Thank you very, very much, Sarah, for that update. And also, as you were mentioning, there was a lot of focus on the contribution from Indigenous communities. So it's really my pleasure to ask Florence Daguitin, who's going to give her reflections on the regional meetings from the point of view of IPBES. And let's hope that Florence can join us. There you are, Florence.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.
And I thank all the people behind the Stakeholders Day event, a very important day for all of us, for giving me the opportunity to share reflections, which I am doing as a member of the Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity and Ecosystems Services, IPBES. The work of IPBES, even at this early in time, has shown its sincerity to include Indigenous peoples and Indigenous and local knowledge, I should say. And this in turn has given encouragement for us Indigenous peoples and local communities to directly participate in the processes of assessment, and it created pathways for the holders of Indigenous and local knowledge to come together with various stakeholders like the local government and national government, the scientists, the academe, and did their own assessment on the community level. It has also been the global assessment, an evidence-based result of science research, has also given us a leverage to promote our rights and give us encouragement to lobby more for the tenure rights of Indigenous peoples, because the rights to our land is the base of our knowledge. That was seen in the Latin America. The coming together of various stakeholders and rights holders have developed research approaches and methodologies like the walking workshops, the mapping, and others as shown in Africa, in generating different knowledge from different perspectives on what is happening to the biodiversities and ecosystems from the past to understand the present and to analyze the gaps for the future action for the restoration, conservation, and enhancement of biodiversity and ecosystems. The coming together demonstrated the wealth and profoundness of wisdom of Indigenous and local knowledge on sustainable use and resource use management of biodiversity and ecosystems. However, the potential of Indigenous and local knowledge to contribute to the solutions brought about by biodiversity loss and ecosystems degradation continue to be suppressed by many obstacles, among which is the still continuing discrimination of Indigenous and local knowledge and the non-implementation of various agreements and policies for the respects of rights and of course the widening inequalities in access to resources. On a personal level, I was very much inspired by also the young career scientists. I hope we can also do more on that in the Indigenous and local knowledge groups. I miss the interaction of ONET and Indigenous and Indigenous peoples and local communities when we do this Stakeholders Day face-to-face. But I'm very happy that despite this, the situation that we are in, we were able to get through this Stakeholders Day. I also noticed that we are few still in the Indigenous peoples and local communities, and we hope to be able to discuss among ourselves on how to improve more our participation. I thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Florence. Yes, I think everybody would like to have more engagement face-to-face, and let's hope that that will be possible at least next year, because it does make a difference. But indeed, thank you for your remarks, and indeed about the important contribution that Indigenous communities can make to biodiversity conservation, and of course, some of the obstacles that you face at the moment in doing that, and of course, the discrimination. Florence mentioned there the early career researchers, as did Sarah, and indeed, we heard a lot from them during the regional days. We heard from a representative of the YES network and from this new SSH network, the Social Sciences and Humanities Network. And we're now going to hear from Paola Fontanella Pisa, who's going to be talking on behalf of YES, ONET, and this new network, the SSH network. So Paola, over to you.
Thank you very much, Claire, for the introduction and for this opportunity. As it has already been mentioned, over the 3 regional sessions, the respective regional assessments have been presented and discussed. These undoubtedly represent a great tool to advance on conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and have been welcomed by all stakeholders. All regions have, however, highlighted difficulties in the translation and integration of this data into management and adaptation plans, which is causing exacerbation of the current conditions. On this line, the discussions over the last few days made clear the fact that all stakeholders play a critical role in making the difference towards implementation of the assessments, and are therefore encouraged to take more proactive role. Another very important aspect that resulted from the regional sessions discussions is related to the limited diversification of stakeholders engaging with IPBES. For future years, there is a clear need and intention to connect to a wider diversity of stakeholders, so to better represent everyone's voices. In this regard, it must also be acknowledged that this year, as we all know, this year's Stakeholder Day has been very unique, especially on behalf of the before mentioned introduced Young Ecosystem Services Specialist Network, otherwise known as the YES network, which I represent in addition of the ONET facilitation team. I would like to express my satisfaction in seeing such a great youth representation and participation for what is probably the first time on Stakeholder Day. The same thing goes also for social sciences, as it was mentioned before. Many were the discussions on including early career professionals and researchers into science policy interaction. And we truly hope this may be a positive start, opening up to more fruitful discussions. In addition, I would like to add a few words about the exceptional modalities of this year's Stakeholder Day. Unfortunately, the impossibility of meeting in person due to the circumstances has ultimately been turned into an opportunity to make Stakeholder Days more inclusive and accessible, encouraging worldwide stakeholders' participation, regardless their current location, and inviting them to more proactively engage to jointly craft the stakeholder opening statements, for example. This was only made possible by the Stakeholder Day project team, who has proven to be able to make the best out of these difficult circumstances and facilitated extremely engaging and inclusive sessions. So I take this opportunity to thank once again the incredible organization of the Stakeholder Day project team, everyone's organization, and thank you, and back to you, Claire.
Thank you very, very much, Paola, indeed, for that wrap up. We've heard from Florence about the importance of harnessing the potential of Indigenous knowledge to contribute to biodiversity, but that there are many barriers to sharing that knowledge. So I'm delighted now to hand over to my co-moderator, Ava, who's going to lead the next session, which is on Indigenous peoples and local communities. Ava, over to you.
Thanks, Claire, and welcome to this session, which will explore the participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities and how they are interacting in IPBES. So as highlighted by the global assessment, and as you might remember, at least a quarter of the global land area is traditionally owned, managed, used, or occupied by Indigenous peoples. And this figure increases significantly when local communities are also included. So that's why Indigenous peoples and local communities are recognized as key actors in relation to achieving biodiversity goals. And they are also key knowledge holders and stakeholders for IPBES from the very beginning. And to enhance its work with IPLCs, IPBES developed an approach to recognizing and working with ILK, which was approved at the 5th IPBES Plenary back in 2017. And this approach included steps to develop a participatory mechanism that aims to ensure participation of IPLCs within all IPBES processes. And today, we will hear from 4 panelists, and as well as from members of the audience about their reflections on the development of this participation in IPBES. So the panelists I'm happy to introduce you to, the first is Joji Carino. She's Ipalua Igoro from the Cordillera region of the Philippines. She's a senior policy advisor of the Forest Peoples Program and a member of the IPBES Task Force on Indigenous and Local Knowledge. So welcome, Josie. Then the next panelist is Viviana Figueroa. She is from Ocumazo Indigenous Community in Argentina. She is a member of the Women's Network on Biodiversity and also a member of the IPBES Task Force on ILK. And then the third panelist, also a member of the Task Force on ILK, is Sherry Pictou. She's a Mi'kmaq from Bear River First Nation in Canada. She's an assistant professor at Dalhousie University in Canada and a member of the ILK. And then the last panelist is Peter Bates. He works in the IPBES Technical Support Unit on Indigenous and Local Knowledge, and that TSU is based at UNESCO in Paris. So welcome to all of you. And I would like to address a question or 3 questions to the first 3 panelists. So the question is, what are your experiences of participating in IPBES? and what are the strengths of this approach and what could be improved. So Josie, can you start sharing your experiences? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Eva. And thank you for this opportunity to share my experiences of participating in IPBES. In keeping with the principles of open science, IPBES from the outset has embedded in its conceptual framework and operational principles valuing the diversity of knowledge systems, including Indigenous and local knowledge, and the participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities in all its functions. IPBES, through its participatory mechanisms, has innovated ways to listen and interact with IPLCs in building the evidence base and knowledge foundations of its various assessments. My collective and personal interactions with the ILK liaison group of authors of the assessments, as well as with individual authors during dialogue sessions on ILK, has been open, respectful, and interactive. And I wish to express my deep appreciation about the progress being made in this regard. And what are some of these strengths? As a science policy platform, I can say from my current engagement in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework that IPBES assessments have great impacts on the policy deliberations of the CBD, particularly its global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services. This is true for a range of issues covered, but significantly for Indigenous peoples and local communities whose vital contributions to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity have been acknowledged and highlighted in the global assessment. So this has certainly helped us in the negotiations. Today is IPBES Stakeholder Day. So it is important to say some words on its impacts on our constituencies and broader society. I wish to affirm that IPBES is stimulating ILK holders and experts, including the network of Centers of Distinction on Indigenous and Local Knowledge, to redouble our efforts to strengthen, revitalize, and share our knowledge towards problem solving in our communities and the wider world. What could be improved? To date, IPBES has so far reached some of the organized networks and organizations of IPLCs, but there are so many more who need to be engaged and want to be engaged. Indigenous peoples from all global regions are important contributors, and there needs to be funding support for Indigenous participants without making distinctions between developed and developing countries. Doing so will strengthen balance and equity in IPBES stakeholder engagements. We need to build the grassroots institutions of Indigenous peoples and local communities working on Indigenous and local knowledge. Higher level bridging mechanisms are also needed to engage knowledge platforms such as IPBES at different scales. Insofar as capacity strengthening for early career researchers and scientists is being strengthened through IPBES fellows, intergenerational transmission of knowledge and capacity building for the youth among Indigenous peoples and local communities also needs targeted attention. So finally, let us all continue our collaboration to strengthen IPBES in all its important functions. Thanks very much. Back to you, Eva.
Thank you, Josie. That was very helpful to give an overview of how you want to build the evidence base, which is so important, the Indigenous knowledge, and share that knowledge on problem solving. So Let's ask the same question to Viviana. Viviana, what is your experience of participating in IPBES, and what can be improved and what are the strengths?
Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches a todos los que están siguiendo esta sesión. Muchísimas gracias a todos los que han hecho posible este importante evento. Quisiera compartirles mi experiencia como miembro del grupo de tareas, pero también en representación de la Red de Mujeres Indígenas sobre Biodiversidad, nuestra experiencia sobre IPBES. Creo que uno de los desafíos más grandes actualmente es cómo incorporar ese valor a los diferentes sistemas de conocimiento. Y en este sentido creo que hay que reconocer que IPBES ha tomado el desafío y ha hecho, implementado en sí acciones concretas para avanzar en esos aspectos. Con lo cual, una de las fortalezas de IPBES es de que lo que ha permitido dentro de lo que es la nominación, es decir, para ser miembros del grupo de tareas, para ser incluso coautores o revisores, le ha dado un espacio, ha reconocido el espacio en sí específico para los pueblos indígenas, con lo cual en el sistema de participación se aceptan y se consideran todas las nominaciones de las organizaciones de pueblos indígenas. Eso es un gran avance porque es un reconocimiento a nuestras particularidades dentro de lo que es el ámbito de los interesados, porque nosotros somos actores principales en la conservación de la biodiversidad. También creo que se ha incorporado en sí el valor a los diferentes sistemas de conocimiento, realizando los diálogos en las diferentes evaluaciones que se realizan, los diálogos entre representantes de pueblos indígenas y los autores de las diferentes evaluaciones. Eso ha sido un punto muy importante porque hemos logrado que, tener ese diálogo sincero y franco, donde hubo un respeto mutuo, apoyo y comprensión, para que los diferentes sistemas de conocimiento y visiones estén reflejados en los informes. Creo que un punto muy importante es que nuestras perspectivas han sido, y nuestras contribuciones con estudios de casos, con material en sí, con publicaciones y con ese diálogo con los autores, eso ha sido incluido en sí en los informes, como en el caso del informe global, lo que para nosotros es un gran avance, porque en muchas ocasiones nos invitan a participar de diálogos, pero al final nuestras contribuciones no están reflejadas. Y a su vez también que haya una preocupación por el IPBES, de que esos resultados también se diseminen a nivel internacional, a nivel regional y local, con lo cual en sí es una herramienta muy práctica para que todos podamos conocer y entender qué es lo que se está haciendo y también que nuestras visiones sean reflejadas y conocidas a nivel mundial. Por eso creo que es una gran fortaleza en sí el trabajo que se hace en el IPBES y en el mecanismo de participación, y que bien nos ha dado herramientas para en sí también reflejar la importancia que en los próximos 30 años el conocimiento tradicional sea en sí esté en la agenda mundial con acciones concretas para su protección y su preservación. También, ¿cómo podemos mejorar? Todavía sigue siendo un desafío la revisión de los informes. Como sabemos, los documentos preliminares son en inglés, la revisión es en inglés, eso aún sigue siendo una limitante. También la importancia de que tengamos en cuenta que los pueblos indígenas, a diferencia de los investigadores, en muy pocas ocasiones cuentan con recursos financieros, mientras que los investigadores en general pertenecen a grandes instituciones, incluso reciben apoyo financiero de los gobiernos. En el caso de los pueblos indígenas no ocurre, con lo cual es importante para que haya una mayor participación de los pueblos indígenas como coautores, como revisores, que haya un mecanismo de apoyo a los pueblos indígenas debido a esas circunstancias. También todavía sigue siendo un desafío hacer o participar más plenamente en el proceso de IPBES, con lo cual es necesario que haya un proceso de fortalecimiento de capacidades para que los pueblos indígenas se involucren más en los procesos, para que sean más autores, más revisores y para que participen más activamente en la realización de las evaluaciones. Creo que tenemos muchos desafíos por delante. También tengamos en cuenta que los primeros borradores de los documentos también se hacen en inglés, con lo cual muchos de nuestros hermanos y hermanas que incluso hablan inglés, el inglés es su tercer idioma. Entonces, creemos que es necesario en sí que también haya un proceso para que nosotros mismos podamos realizar nuestras evaluaciones y contribuir, para lo cual se precisa de apoyo financiero y técnico. Hemos avanzado mucho en estos años y creo que todavía nos queda un largo camino, y los pueblos, y especialmente las mujeres indígenas, estamos listas para seguir contribuyendo en este proceso y esperamos que juntos podamos seguir avanzando y mejorando el mecanismo de participación. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Viviana. That was really insightful to see that there is a special place in IPBES, but there is also a lot of challenges ahead to include more ILK people and also their knowledge. But it's good to hear that there is already some progress, and there is, of course, as we know, already some knowledge in the, for example, the global assessment and the previous ones as well. So that's really an interesting session, I think. So I'm happy now to hear the third voice from the very north in Canada, from Sherry Pictou. Sherry,
yes.
Same questions to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Eva. Hi, it's such an honor to be here and to participate with all of these fantastic knowledge holders. And as Eva says, I'm a Mi'kmaq woman from my ancestral homelands in Mi'kma'ki, but otherwise known as Nova Scotia, Canada. And I also just want to take a brief second to acknowledge all the Indigenous people on the call and for welcoming us into your ancestral homelands, wherever that may be. I became involved in IPBES initially through the dialogue sessions on Indigenous and local knowledge, those dialogue sessions. And they were facilitated and chaired by Marla Emery and, of course, Peter Bates. And what was, so I'm going to talk a little bit across the different levels here, because after that I was nominated by my country, the focal point, which would be Environmental Climate Change Canada, to sit on the task force on Indigenous and local knowledge. And what was very interesting to me from those initial dialogue sessions was how Marla and Peter exercised the free, prior, and informed consent. I've never been in sessions where that was actually acknowledged and practiced. For example, we were informed how the process would be, where we could interject. There was permission asked to use our pictures. We had participation in the actual report before that had went out. And what was very unique was providing an opportunity for the Indigenous participants to meet amongst themselves. And it's sort of an Indigenous caucus, as they called it. And I've never had that opportunity where we could, discuss how the process was going, if there was any issues that someone maybe was too shy to bring up, and then we would provide feedback. And so I really appreciate to see free and prior and informed consent, which, as we know, is a fundamental principle of the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, being practiced. And that has been scaled up too. And I've noticed that even though we have time constraints, is trying to do that at the task force level as well. Wow. I think I have three main ongoing challenges. From an academic perspective, of course, it's this bridging of the natural sciences with the social sciences, and trying to do this transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary approach. And I know this is an ongoing struggle, but I do see some improvement. And this is so fundamentally important for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge holders. I know we have a ways to go, but it would help us so much, as opposed to just trying to integrate our knowledge into existing frameworks, but to actually honor that knowledge. And of course, what is so important for Indigenous people is that their knowledge is lived with biodiversity. Biodiversity is not separate from human interaction. And I've seen a little bit attempt to do this transdisciplinary approach, if you will, when all the task force were able to meet in Bonn, Germany in the fall of 2019. Just little did we know, this was a few months before COVID had hit. And I was really impressed with how there was a real attempt for those task forces to work together and to address Indigenous and local knowledge. I just want to express why this bridging of the disciplines is so important for Indigenous people. And as I said, we can't sort of separate ourselves from biodiversity, from the land, from the water, from those sources, and so forth. And as our elder here at home always states, we have an inherent responsibility to ensure that whatever we use from the land and the water, we do so without compromising the integrity of those ecosystems. And so in a way, when we talk about values to humans, we have to think about how humans can be valuable to those ecosystems. And the second thing that is a major challenge is addressing the SDGs. And I know every assessment tries to do this. And what's so fundamentally problematic about that is that there's only a couple of SDGs that mentions Indigenous people. And there's been some work done by Indigenous people themselves that all 17 SDGs apply to Indigenous people. And the other issue is with gender. We'll see gender, women, and so forth mentioned through, some of the scoping documents and so forth, but they never acknowledge the SDG number 5, the gender equality one. And I think from a practical standpoint, and I know this is challenging because of the time constraints and so forth, is that that we make time for ceremony, not just for ceremonial's sake. And what I mean by that, ceremony can be an opening, a song, what have you. And that's so important for Indigenous people, because that is the way they transfer their knowledge. And that is knowledge. And I know that that's really hard for scientists to encompass, but that's how we've transferred our knowledge for generations. And it's also to respect when we come into somebody else's territory, or when we're welcoming somebody to our territory. And I know that's difficult with the time constraints, but to make some acknowledgement with that. And but overall, the dialogue process right up to the task force process has been, to a great extent, very participatory. We have inputs with the scoping, the drafting of the chapters. Particularly, we're provided opportunities to engage with the authors, reviewing and commenting on drafts, including the summary for policymakers, which I think is so fundamentally important. As my sister Vivian had stated, though, this being only done in English most of the time is very problematic to ensure that there's full and accurate participation. And I think I'll leave it with but with just end with a note from this week's session on the Indigenous and local knowledge. One of the participants, how they highlighted, when biodiversity is in decline, so is in our knowledge, because our culture, our language, and our practices and how we transfer knowledge is all rooted in biodiversity. Ms. Nogama, all my relations, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Terry. Thanks for your experiences. I'm glad that the expert on rights is happy about the free, prior, and informed consent being lived in IPBES, and also about your experiences in bridging the different sciences, and that biodiversity is not separate from humans. That value system should be emphasized more in all our conservation efforts. So really glad to get all your experiences. And now I'd like to ask Peter Bates, who is in the TSU, the technical support unit, who is more in the organizing of these processes. And what are your impressions, and also how you want to go forward with the TSU? What would you like to improve in the future? Thanks, Peter.
Great, thank you very much, Eva, and thanks to Joji, Viviana, and Sherry for sharing those, sharing your thoughts. It's always nice to have positive feedback, and it's just really great to hear that yeah, you recognise the progress that IPBES is making, whilst also noting that there are many ways that we can still be improving. So I won't talk for very long because we want to leave a space for participants from the floor to also share their thoughts. So just a few things I wanted to highlight, coming back on what the previous speakers had said. In terms of the assessments and the dialogue workshop processes, it seems like we have a fairly good process going there. We also do the call for contributions, which brings in knowledge and information from communities that's not necessarily available through peer-reviewed journal articles. We're also at present further developing the data management policy of IPBES to better include Indigenous and local knowledge and the concerns of Indigenous peoples, particularly following the CARE principles, which have been developed by Indigenous groups. So that's something that's going on in the background to further enhance our work with Indigenous and local knowledge, and to try to make sure that it's as appropriate and as respectful as possible. And then other things we're hearing that need to be improved. Definitely the language barrier is always an issue. We're trying to do more work in Spanish and French as well in terms of the dialogue workshops, but there's always limitations around that, but that's something we definitely want to work on. And then also in terms of Indigenous peoples and local community members as authors in the assessments, and particularly through that the fellowship program of IPBES could be potentially very interesting in the coming months as we move towards the nexus and the transformative change assessments. So we'll be hoping that we can encourage some young Indigenous peoples and local communities to be involved in that way at the at the grassroots level in the assessments. And then other things from the previous speakers, and also from listening to the discussions over the previous few days, the community-based research issue, I think, is really, really important and really critical. And it's something we haven't had the resources to really focus on previously. But through the task force on knowledge and data, there's now going to be a more rigorous process for stimulating research and catalyzing research around knowledge gaps in assessments. And that'll be stimulating research, but also hopefully stimulating funding and support for that research. And as Indigenous and local knowledge is often flagged as a gap in IPBES assessments, not in terms of the knowledge itself, but in terms of the accessibility of that knowledge to IPBES assessments, we're hoping there'll be a lot of work that IPBES can hopefully stimulate to actually encourage community-based research and provide the support that's needed there, that we're hearing the speakers ask for. And then the other area of focus, which I think will develop over the next years, is the dialogue between policymakers and Indigenous peoples and local communities. And again, we've started to do this around the results of the assessments, for example, the global assessment. We'll also be working more and more closely with the BestNet program, which some of you may know. It's a program run by UNDP and UNEP WCMC, and now UNESCO is also part of that consortium. And so there'll be more and more focus on building work with Indigenous peoples and local communities into the trialogue processes that they develop, which are between discussions between policymakers, scientists and practitioners, and also Indigenous peoples and local communities. So I think that's the way that IPBES work can, again, be stimulating more work outside of the assessment process. So that'll be hopefully very exciting and something that Indigenous peoples and local communities will find very interesting. And then also, finally, for me, we'll also be increasingly going to be working in the next months and years on looking at scenarios that include Indigenous and local knowledge and participatory scenarios working with Indigenous peoples and local communities. And that's both in terms of the Nature Futures framework, which is being developed by the Task Force on Scenarios and Models, and also in terms of hopefully as well stimulating community-based research on scenarios. And we know some of our partners, for example, Swed Bio, are already doing work on that. So there's this broader network as well that's also working with IPBES to try to bring some of these really crucial activities for and with Indigenous peoples and local communities. So yeah, that's all I'll say for now. And just thank you very much to all of the speakers who've taken part over the last 3 days. We're always listening, and it's always great to hear how we can be improving. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. That was really helpful to hear your organizing perspective on the from the TSU. It looks like you're basically everywhere engaging ILK into the various IPBES processes. So that's great. So now we have almost 25 minutes to hear your voices. So I will take brief comments and questions from the audience. If you would like to be upgraded as a speaker, please put your mic on and switch on your camera. And you can also leave, let me know in the chat when you want to be speaking. And if you have a written question, you can put it in the Q&A box, and this will be either addressed then in this discussion, or maybe just answered in writing. So we have already 2 volunteers I know from in advance. So we have Yesenia Hernandez. Would you give your comment? Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. I will be deliver my comments in Spanish. Padiush, that means good morning and good evening and good afternoon and evening for all of you. Muchas gracias por estar hoy y por haber organizado esta serie de webinars y de los días de las partes interesadas, particularmente como una mujer indígena que se ha acercado a la ciencia. Y el trabajo de IPBES ha sido muy importante para mí y creo que he encontrado, como dicen desde el punto de vista ecológico, un nicho donde actuar y donde trabajar a través de este diálogo entre las distintas formas del conocimiento para promover medidas de conservación de la biodiversidad. Me parece muy pertinente este diálogo, pero que este diálogo IPBES lo haya promovido y trabajado ya desde una perspectiva con método, con reglas, con procesos que si bien son bastante estructurados desde el punto de vista de ciencia moderna y que a veces hay retos para nosotros en las comunidades, siento que es una forma importante de trabajar y una forma bastante pertinente. Incluso otra de las cuestiones es esa flexibilidad que ha habido. Sí, hay todavía muchos retos, como dijo la hermana Viviana, en materia de lenguaje, pero también retos y experiencias importantes, ¿no? Como el hecho de esa apertura, por ejemplo, para hacer un taller de values en una comunidad y con todo lo que implicó del traslado de personas, etcétera, pero creo que también esa parte de cómo ver cómo en las comunidades o cómo a nivel local se está viviendo esa relación con la biodiversidad, abre más los ojos, tanto pues, como autores, como personas funcionarios de IPBES, y bueno, obviamente entre nosotros intercambiar creo que son cosas muy valiosas. Y también los mensajes que pues ya lo han dicho todos y yo quiero recalcar que han sido de suma utilidad para conocer, para fortalecer el conocimiento sobre nuestra importancia como pueblos indígenas, al ser personas que pues somos actores clave, ¿no? Que a veces no se nos reconoce en lo político, no se nos reconoce en lo económico, como dijo Yogi, pero somos personas que estamos trabajando en esta parte de la biodiversidad y que el mensaje de IPBES lanza la pregunta y creo que también ayuda a responderla de cómo fortalecer este papel, cómo fortalecer nuestro trabajo, pues a través del enfoque de los derechos a una participación plena y efectiva en tomas de decisiones y a la certeza jurídica, al fortalecimiento de ese acceso a los territorios, de esa certeza sobre la tierra que estamos cuidando, trabajando, ¿no? Y finalmente, en mi experiencia en campo, ese autorreconocimiento en las comunidades que también hace mucha falta, después de pues, muchos años en los que hemos estado en relaciones dispares con otros sectores de la sociedad, ese mensaje de, bueno, es que eres muy importante para la comunidad global porque tú estás conservando, porque tú estás haciendo cosas desde tu conocimiento, desde tu saber y desde tu cosmovisión, que pues nos apoyan a todos, ¿no? Entonces, también esa otra de las cosas que estamos empezando a replantearnos es los mensajes sobre el modelo actual de conservación de áreas naturales protegidas, que si bien es muy noble en su objetivo, también sabemos que ha tenido impactos en desplazamientos, pero pues ya con esta información de los assessments, información que se ha generado, pues también invitar a los gobiernos a replantearse, bueno, qué tan pertinente es que yo saque a todas las personas de un área protegida cuando realmente la quiero proteger porque está en buen estado y está en buen estado porque ha habido buen manejo. Y bueno, entre los retos que yo he visto, perdón, yo seguí las líneas de las preguntas que hicieron, es que una de las cuestiones y que lo trabajo también con muchos otros espacios donde participo, es esa recomendación que siempre hago de conocer bien los alcances de la institución con la que trabajamos, ¿no? ¿Qué hace, qué no hace? Y para esto el entendimiento del marco conceptual desde un punto de vista culturalmente adecuado creo que va a ser muy importante y necesario para ampliar esa interacción. También nosotros, pues como personas que ya estamos en el IPBES o que ya hemos tenido algún contacto con el trabajo de la plataforma, pues contribuir a compartir esos mensajes. Esos mensajes, esa información sobre cómo también mejorar esa participación. Por ejemplo, incluso a veces a nivel México o a nivel región, pues hemos aclarado cómo, qué se busca o por qué, por ejemplo, a veces se busca eso de la mejor información disponible, etcétera. Y también, pues, en particular en estos meses hemos visto los retos tecnológicos de nuestras hermanas y hermanos. No solo es el acceso a una conexión de Internet, sino también el acceso a herramientas adecuadas. La necesidad de fortalecer ese diálogo que creo que en sus inicios va bien con ese respeto que dijo Viviana que tienen los autores y también más interacción. Podríamos hacer algunas cuestiones con otras task force, por ejemplo, creación de capacidades, como ya lo comentaban. Y algo de la parte también metodológica de IPBES, creo que con los pueblos indígenas en el tema de la seriedad del manejo de los documentos, de muchas cuestiones internas, creo que con nosotros no hay reto porque también nosotros tenemos ciertas cuestiones de organización y de cómo trabajar y cómo cuidar cosas, ¿no? Entonces, finalmente quisiera mandarles un mensaje, recordarles que nosotros como pueblos y comunidades indígenas cuidamos de la naturaleza, no solo para nuestra vida o para los de nuestra gente, sino también como un compromiso ético con la madre tierra, con nuestros hermanos de la comunidad humana, bajo los principios de solidaridad y de colaboración, que desde mi punto de vista personal debería ser en ambos lados, y esperemos que se siga trabajando para eso, y que el trabajo de IPBES es una gran herramienta al generar información con bases sólidas sobre lo que hacemos, y también para llamar la atención sobre la importancia de nuestros aportes. Y también, como dije, para el autorreconocimiento que también nos fortalece mucho a nivel individual y comunitario. Y bueno, es momento de recuperar esos diálogos entre las distintas formas de ver el mundo, de conocernos y para tener, como ya les dije, esas relaciones de equilibrio, porque la humanidad en este momento enfrenta retos en materia de conservación de la naturaleza, en materia social, en materia económica, y que esos retos solamente se van a trabajar o a resolver si pues colaboramos juntos. Y bueno, Stu Shibu, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Yesenia, from your experiences from Mexico. It's great to see that IPBES is also affecting and helping promoting your work there. That's really helpful. So let's go over to Lucy Mulenki. She also wanted to raise her voice. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll be very brief. I just wanted to reaffirm the sentiments given by both Georgie, Sherry, Viviana, and Peter, and really confirm and say that IPBES, in my experience, on how we've been reflecting in the different discussions that has been taking place, not only during these stakeholders week or days, but also in the past where we've been working with different issues, has really brought quite some relationship and has also made us strengthen our work in terms of looking at different scientific and local knowledge together. It's very, very important, and has been really very important to bring these issues on the table and for Indigenous people to understand science and knowledge and being able to integrate them together. And also my other experience is that what we learn there in participating ourselves, coming from the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, we take it down to the ground. And if you look at that local knowledge out there, it's quite related with the science. I keep saying that Indigenous peoples themselves are really good scientists and have got this knowledge. And we appreciate the fact that with IPBES, working with scientists and researchers, this has really helped us a lot in terms of looking at the issues together. And also to confirm that these issues are all related, they're interconnected. They are connected. It's the way you can integrate everything together. When you look at food, when you look at biodiversity, look at areas of water and environment in general and climate change, they are all integrated together and they impact each other. And I think for Indigenous people, it's really very important for what we have already discussed in these particular processes in IPBES. It has continued building our knowledge, strengthening our relationship, as I indicated, and want to confirm that all the rest, the recommendations that have been given by our sisters who had spoken earlier and Peter are really very important, and we acknowledge that. We are also very happy as International Indigenous Forum to see the way forward of what Peter has already put down for us and given us the ideas on the way forward, especially looking at that community research and being able to have the people really work together. And also bringing the issue of fellowship is very, very important, because we want the young people to also be able to learn what we are learning, especially on the local knowledge, and to be able to understand it and to take the way forward. And since we have the local biodiversity outlook, that also is going to enhance a lot of work with the points that Peter already has given as the way forward. So mine is to reaffirm and to support what the rest have said. And as in International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, we really look forward to a continuous working relationship and working together. And as Florence has said in the beginning, we'll also try to see how we can have a full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples in this particular, and local communities in this particular process, because we know there are some challenges that are there already. Thank you very much. And I wish everyone a very successful time during these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Very helpful comment. Thank you. So we have a written question from Bernadette Snow to Sherry, the panelist Sherry. So the question is, how can we mainstream and honor Indigenous and local knowledge and ensure this is respected as lived experiences with biodiversity? Sherry, are you ready to answer that question?
Yes, I typed in the in response to the question was just recently, we still have a long ways to go. I have another critical piece coming, but just recently, my colleagues at Dalhousie University and with some Mi'kmaq people, as well as some Indigenous people actually across Canada, we had pooled all our knowledge together in this article. And it starts out with, and it's within Fawcett's, the Fawcett's Journal. And we were able to put as the prime author, Misidnogama, which in my language means all of our relations. And we were so pleased that the journal was willing to do that. So before we started listening to the authors, we wanted to acknowledge all our relations. So that's one source. It's, from the Canadian context, but we talk about the international forums in that article as well. And there will be a forthcoming one as well. So that gives you some ideas. I'm not sure if it's, they're concrete, practical ideas, but it's something for particularly environmental scientists to be aware of and how they engage and build relationships with Indigenous people as opposed to just extracting the knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. Another question to you. Are there, do you have any experience in projects reconciling academic disciplines with natural scientists and social scientists on board and ILK? Because you were mentioning that in your panel speech. Do you have any
I was very fortunate. It's still an ongoing struggle, but I was very fortunate when I'm an older woman that decided to go back and do my PhD later in life. And I was very fortunate with the committee that I had somebody from international development. I had somebody from sociology and anthropology. I had someone with the environmental sciences, and I had someone with adult education. So it was quite a mixed group. And I was very fortunate that they let me apply Indigenous methodologies. And this is something that I find that academia takes for granted, that there are Indigenous academics, there are Indigenous scholars who speak to this all the time. And there's been several fantastic books that put out from Marari Linda Smith to Deb McGregor here in Canada, who is an editor on this fabulous book on Indigenous methodology. And there we do take this very holistic approach, and you have to kind of be open to and I was fortunate because also my PhD was interdisciplinary. And so there are ways to do that. And with my particular work, I've always put the Indigenous voices first, with their permission, of course. And so that kind of helps bridge, and it's difficult sometimes. This is why I'm always for the interdisciplinary approach. And I know that's really difficult, for hardcore scientists, but I think that really the songs, the ceremony, the stories, and so forth could really support science. And so anyways, that's probably a long-winded answer, but there are ways to do that. And I would particularly urge people to pay attention to Indigenous methodologies, Indigenous approaches to research. Thanks.
Thank you, Sherry. That was really insightful. So I saw that Judith Fisher, she is in the audience, and she was there from the very early beginning, including ILK. I'd probably like to ask if she could probably, now that she sees all the developments going on, if she's happy with it, if she would like to be upgraded as a speaker, we could still include her. And then I wanted to ask Peter, also from the panel, if there are some regions or sub-regions which are not enough represented so far in the task force, and how are you going to address it?
Shall I speak?
Yes. Judith, you're here. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yes,
Great
I vanished
to see you.
and now
Yes.
I'm back again.
Yeah.
I would. I think it's quite overwhelming, the progress that has been made with all the Indigenous knowledge and its incorporation into this. As you mentioned, I have been working on the Indigenous space since very, very early days within IPBES and away from IPBES. And it is so rewarding to hear Josie and others speaking about where they feel as Indigenous people this process has evolved to, and also the approaches we need to take further forward. So I'd just like to congratulate the real tolerance of all Indigenous people throughout this evolution. And also as a member of the ILK task force, along with the wonderful people you've heard speaking today, it's really rewarding to hear what they've said and to keep expanding further to really advance the work which Indigenous people are making around the world. And I'd just like to make one more comment on one of Josie's comments about there are many, many Indigenous people who would like to be involved, who are not part of networks, but that is growing all the time. And I think it's going to be intriguing to work out how we can include them into the future. So thank you for everyone for all the contributions you've made over the years. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. That was nice because I saw all your happy comments. So I thought it would be good to have you at the end of the session. So yes, maybe if Peter would be available. Yes, could you expand on that, how to represent all the regions and sub-regions, and are there any gaps?
Yeah, I would say the big gaps, we always have a gap for Eastern Europe. So that's something we're always working on. And then I would say probably Western Africa as well. And again, that comes back to the language issue of needing to work in French to really reach people in Western Africa. But then there's a overarching gap of the whole world in that we can only reach so many people and work with so many people at the same time. So definitely finding new mechanisms to build and work with new organizations and new individuals is always something we'll be looking to do over the next months and years.
Thanks a lot. So great. I think that's maybe we have one more question to Georgie. Yeah, on expanding not just the geographical gaps, but also the other organizations of IPLC you want to be and see engaged with IPBES. How can national focal points and national platforms help to identify these and trying to invite them? Do you see a chance of the national platforms as an instrument to reach out? Josie, did you try that?
Thanks, Eva. I think this is really where the real challenge and where the real change can also happen, when we are engaged very directly with the focal points, but more widely governments and other very active folks in our countries. I think we need to really address the issue of funding. We very much want to expand our networks and to do a lot of outreach activities, but funding is really an obstacle, right?
Yes.
But, you know, I'm quite happy that listening to the negotiations in the CBD, so many governments are now acknowledging the importance of Indigenous peoples and local communities. I think IPBES contributed to that. And we're really looking forward that not just in the NBSAPs, but also in national platforms on knowledge, we can be working a lot more with governments in our countries. Thanks.
Thanks, Josie. Yeah, I recognize the same in the Substar, maybe due to IPBES and due to your work. So thanks a lot. And I'd like to close that session with many thanks to all the panelists and the speakers from the audience and Judith coming in. So, and I also wanted to, because that's what is mentioned several times, that the songs are important. So if you join the IPBES session after that closing to draft the remarks, there is a treat, a song treat for you, just a little advertisement. So over to you, Claire, for the next session.
Thank you very, very much, Eva, for that interesting session on, yes, the cultural importance of the ceremonies for Indigenous people, just as Sherry was saying. I would now like to introduce the next moderator, Sonia Georgiev, who's Head of Development at IPBES, and who will be leading a discussion on widening engagement with business. If you've been with us since the opening ceremony, you will have noticed that there are a lot of questions about engagement with the private sector. So I hope that you're going to find some answers in the next session, which is moderated by Sonia. Sonia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. So indeed, supply chain actors have engaged with IPBES and are applying IPBES findings in their efforts to avoid and reduce biodiversity loss and restore and regenerate habitats. The extraction of raw materials from agriculture and forestry are significant drivers of biodiversity loss. The fashion industry, for instance, that is using raw materials such as cotton, viscose, wool, leather, and cashmere, is impacting biodiversity through deforestation, intensive use of water and chemicals, and land use. I'm delighted to be joined by two representatives of the multinational fashion industry, Jenny Granstrom, a business expert in biodiversity, animal welfare, and material ethics at H&M Group, and Helen Crowley, who is head of sustainable sourcing and nature initiatives of the global luxury group Kering, as well as Pauline Kalunda, the executive director of Eco Trust, a conservation national trust in Uganda involved in carbon offsetting, insets, meaning integrating biodiversity into the value chain, and offtakes, that is buying of sustainable products. Pauline is also a scoping expert on the forthcoming IPBES assessment on business and biodiversity. Let me start with Jenny of H&M Group. Jenny, how important are IPBES findings to managing your supply chains?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Sonia. I would say that the work on our biodiversity ambition, we have included a scientific approach already from the beginning. So IPBES work will be our foundation in everything that we do. So for us, science is the key to understand what we need to achieve in order for us to become net positive. And I think that science will also be what everyone can collaborate upon, and to make sure that all the different industries and sectors are actually working in the same direction. But for us as well, I believe that leaning towards science in our journey will make us credible to our customers, for us actually to be able to show in a transparent way what we stand for and how we do it. So at H&M Group, we want to significantly reduce the negative impact on biodiversity, and we want to be part of the solution moving forward. We believe that the impact of our sector comes with the opportunities to contribute to building resiliency into the value chains. And this, of course, goes hand in hand with a long-term sustainability vision to lead the change toward a circular and climate positive fashion industry. And also, as an ending, the findings will also enable us to find science-based ways forward to support the industry and legislators to enable and promote a sustainable future for the fashion industry, one in which our natural ecosystems and biodiversity is respected and supported.
Thank you, Jenny. What about you, Helen? How important are IPBES findings to managing the supply chains of a luxury group like Kering?
Great, thanks. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me to speak briefly about this very important topic, and congratulations on the work that you're all doing. It's an incredible community of people, IPBES. And I just would sort of really underline what Jenny so eloquently said. I mean, science matters in everything, but it certainly matters when you have to start making decisions about what to do, what to prioritize, what to look at in these sort of complex supply chains and complex companies across many geographies. So I think there, just to be a bit more specific to your answer, I think there are 3 points I would make. One is, I think, let me just say, firstly, the IPBES report of 2019 was absolutely, as we will all acknowledge, but I want to say it again, a watershed moment in terms of awareness of the importance of biodiversity and biodiversity writ large, species, ecosystems, nature's contributions to people. And that has just changed the narrative, has contributed to a new way of looking at sustainability that isn't just climate, that isn't just doing less bad, but is about building in nature and understanding impact dependency, and then what we're going to do about it to do not only less bad, but to do more good, restorative, regenerative. So at a very sort of high level and significant level, it has really changed the narrative in corporate sustainability. At a sort of more granular, in like at Kering, in what we do in our supply chains, it's helped us build in more robust ways, the IPBES report and the IPBES work, more robust ways, nature and nature-related risk, dependency, impact, and understanding how to deal with that in our approaches through our supply chain. It was always there, but we sort of pulled it out with more specificity and focus, and we developed a biodiversity strategy last year that's to really address biodiversity more explicitly, rather than sort of imagining or hoping it was an implicit in our other sustainability approaches, which we try to do. So that's been a really important shift. And I think that, along with, just to add one final point, is the development of the science-based targets for nature, and that sort of science-based framing for how companies can set targets, be accountable. Now there's a task force for nature-related risk disclosure that's being launched, I think, tomorrow. And that is another way of how companies are going to be accountable for the impacts and dependencies, or impacts and risk on nature. All of these are sort of heading us very, very strongly in the right direction to deal with our nature risks, and to help sort of be more of a positive force out there. And it's all underpinned by science. And the science matters so much. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Helen. What about you, Pauline? How relevant are IPBES findings to your conservation financing work?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, and thank you for having me. As an organization that specializes in conservation financing, these findings are very useful for us. Our model is based on delivering money where it matters, and where it matters is where there are people, where there is biodiversity, and where it all interacts. Now, the IPBES findings provide the science behind the models. So we use it to develop the investment options that we present to people. We get our money from public sources, but also from private sources. So the science within the IPBES, and the fact that it has been produced at international scale, peer referenced, gives us the basis to develop our proposition to the different sources of financing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pauline. Comforting to note the three of you agree on how much science will be key to understand and guide transition to more sustainable supply chains and regenerative farming practices. Now, let's take a closer look at the pragmatic issues you are facing on the ground. I'm turning to H&M and Kering. You both are fashion companies, but you don't own your supply chain factories, and you have complex supply chains from the farm to the fashion store. So how do you verify that your materials are sustainably sourced? Jenny, perhaps, and then Helen?
Yeah, so this topic is a really interesting one. And first off, of course, I need to emphasize the need for us to reduce the use of natural resources overall and to use more recycled materials. And then we, of course, also need to make sure that the natural materials that we are sourcing is sourced in a more sustainable way. And already today, we are actually sourcing almost 65% of our material from recycled or sustainably sourced. So for the sustainably sourced raw material that we use, we'll start with understanding where we have the impact on biodiversity and what is needed to reduce that impact on nature. And what is needed to establish a connection all the way down from us as a brand on the top end through the whole value chain actors and the way down to farm level. This mapping will probably be one of the most challenging work connected to biodiversity. But at H&M, we already have great work ongoing here that also will tap into the focus for biodiversity. So I'm confident that we will have the common tools that is needed in place in a not too far distance. But one method that is out there already and that we are using a lot is, of course, to rely on high quality standards and certifications. And the share of certified materials we're using today is already quite high, and we have ambitious goals set for the upcoming years. And for the standards and certifications that we use, we also try to push the development forward so that biodiversity and traceability is covered to some extent already there. And we believe that if we reach a sanity level for our certified material, it will be so much easier for us to take on the additional actions needed to achieve our ambition. And it also provides a common framework for us as brands, as you mentioned, share the same supplier relationship. And I think another advantage also with using certified material where biodiversity is included is that farmers and other players in the supply chain will have reached a level of understanding of mitigation activities needed. And they will have investigated the area to some extent already when we tap in. But to go back to your specific question, what we do to secure the material that we consider sustainably sourced. So in addition to using standardized certified materials, we also have close collaboration with both our tier 1s and tier 2s. And all our requirements and expectations on our suppliers are outlined in our sustainability commitment. And of course, we also perform both on-site and desktop audits on a regular basis.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Same question to Karen.
Yeah, sure. Hi. Again, I'll build a little bit on what Jenny has said and maybe add some extra nuances from our perspective. So, of course, circularity and material efficiency and upcycling, recycling, and all those things you hear a lot about in fashion are super important to reduce our pressure on all sorts of resources that have ultimately impacts on biodiversity. But one of the most powerful pillars in circularity, and one of the most sort of powerful forces we have is the sort of regenerative raw material lens, where you actually sort of turn agricultural forestry based materials into a driver of positive outcomes as opposed to a driver of negative outcomes. So this is where the focus on how do you work with those production systems that you rightly noted, Sonia, we don't own, way upstream in our supply chains to really make a difference and drive more responsible and sustainable practices in those production systems. So let me just take a step back. One of the reasons it's not the only place in our supply chain that we have impact on biodiversity or impact on many things, but that it is also what Caring's environment profit and loss has shown is that it's the raw materials are about 70% of the footprint. So one thing to do is to really focus on that, and important priority is to focus on those raw materials and say, okay, we're going to not only reduce that footprint, but with natural materials, you have the power to do the restorative regenerative approach that you don't with non-natural or non-renewable materials. So that's where we're really focusing a lot of attention, and we launched the Regenerative Fund for Nature to help support best practices and understand best practices and measure best practices so that we can get the outcomes for biodiversity and climate in these different systems. But one thing I want to say about certification, I agree with Jenny, and in fact, across our sector and many sectors, certification is a really important tool for us. I mean, when you're working across multiple supply chains, you can't get to visit every farm, you can't get to visit every forest. You've got to rely on third-party verified systems to tell you these are the best practices in place. However, and there's some really good certifications out there, totally support that. It is a tool. And we do need to continue. It's not the only thing, and it's not capturing everything. It doesn't necessarily, a lot of certifications don't focus a lot on biodiversity or species impact specifically. There's sort of an indirect correlation. So I think we have some work to do to maybe build these out, these certification approaches, so that they really do direct, again, back to IPBES's work, what are the priorities in different areas and different production systems that we need to really hone our focus through, and certification can help us do that if we can't get out to the farm. So that's something to look at. There are certifications like wildlife friendly, which are really brilliant because they're specifically about trying to reduce impacts on key species and so on. But there are very few that are really targeted on species. So that is one important thing that we do, is look at certification, but it's not the only thing. It helps us sort of get there. The get to sort of the right types of practices. The other thing that's changing, which is a really good change, is that a lot of certifications have been based on practice-based, and what we want to now look at is outcome-based. What outcomes are we having by change, especially in regenerative agriculture, as we try all these different things to regenerate the soil, to build connectivity in landscapes? Are we getting the outcomes that we want, not just ticking the boxes of practices? So there's a lot to do in this verification, but it's sort of an exciting, rapidly evolving field, and there's even technologies now that you can trace things all around the world. Some quite interesting technologies that can help reinforce creating these good standards and best practices and measuring outcomes.
Thank you very much, Helen. Pauline, from a developing world perspective, what is your view of their responsible sourcing efforts? Should they take anything else into account?
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting question. And listening to the two speakers, I really like the efforts. I appreciate the efforts. And I also like the what is coming out as, what is standing out as the shift, or as the improvements to, yes, utilizing certifications as a tool, but also realizing that certification has limitations. So from where we operate, we are in a supply chain that is made up of multitudes of suppliers from different locations, different biophysical characteristics, different socioeconomic characteristics. Now, one of the shortcomings of certification is that much as they give you a tool to access the suppliers, they kind of also maintain it as impersonal. Yet, from our experience, the relations or the attempts that have been really successful are where the supply chain actors are regarded as partners in this, where the value chain or the manufacturer is able to develop a common understanding of risk. A common understanding of risk, not just to biodiversity, but to the business. Because, for example, the coffee value chain, the productivity, quality of coffee, even the cotton quality is at risk if there are threats to water and threats to pollinators and so on and so forth. So rather than stick to the do no good, do no harm, there is need to go beyond to know that your own value chain is at risk if you do nothing, if you continue with business as usual. And we have had some, we, for example, had a sugarcane company that used to just engage lightly with the environment. But the day they understood that the fires that caused them about 30% loss in their cane are interrelated with the conservation of wetlands, they were able to invest in the management of wetlands by communities, and they were able to reduce 90% of the fires on their own estate. So such investments where you're actively involved with your supply chain partners and develop design interventions that not only benefit biodiversity, but also reduce your own risk as a business have been the most successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pauline. Jenny and Helen, very quickly, because we are running out of time, what's your answer to the necessity to better take into account the interests of the smallholders? And your answer could also provide the opportunity to mention other challenges you are facing.
Yeah. Shall I go? Thank you, Pauline. Super good points, and totally agree. I mean, nothing replaces certification or whatever. That doesn't replace actually getting to know your supply chain and understanding who your producers are. It is tough to do that across a lot of supply chains, but it is not just, it has to be this building of a collaborative approach across supply chains and right down to producers, and really understanding who's producing these materials for us and how to support them to transition to better practices. There's no getting out of that being a critical part of supply chain transformation. And let's be clear, for companies to really have the positive impact on biodiversity that we want to and that we're aspiring to, particularly in a short space of time, and to have it done in a socially just way, is nothing less than complete transformation of supply chains. So there's a lot of work to do. So you're spot on in highlighting that as a priority. I think all of us, H&M and Caring, I can't speak for H&M, but a lot of us, the brands, we're in coalitions together, trying, whether it's the Organic Cotton Accelerator or it's the Fashion Pact, trying to figure out also how collectively we can actually support smallholder producers and the right sort of transformations across our supply chain, but the sector as well, so that we do this in a collaborative way and it isn't just sort of command and control sort of down the supply chain.
Thank you, Helen. Jenny, a reaction very quickly, please.
Yeah, I can only echo both Helen and Pauline. I mean, collaboration will be key here, independent. If we are looking at certified and non-certified material, I mean, we do need to find a better way to cooperate all the way through this spider web from brands down to farmer level, and to make sure that we all agree on the same goals, because that will, of course, be the way to manage the best possible transition and results for biodiversity.
Thank you, Jenny. So Pauline, after hearing the solutions proposed by Caring and H&M, what do you consider responsible sourcing best practice to avoid and reduce biodiversity loss?
Thank you very much. And I just want to pick and echo what they've just said, transformational. Because a partner or a private sector company that is committed to transforming and understands that it requires a transformative change. So once they get that right and commit to investing in as much as possible where they can to this transformative change, then we will get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pauline. So to summarize, the three of you share common positions on the importance of science-based guidance, the necessity to transition to regenerative farming to improve the health of the ecosystems as well as the livelihoods of those who work on the land, to shift your production practices to reduce waste, energy, and water use, to shift your business models towards circularity. So I think overall you agree, but the solutions you propose may differ a bit. But this exchange, however short, gave us the opportunity to grasp the complexity of those issues and the long-term endeavor those supply chain transformations will require. So we understood there is a strong need for more transparency, traceability, equity in supply chains, and probably on the other end of the chain, the need to help consumers change their consumption habits. Maybe one last question. This will be the final question. We're running out of time. What else would you need from IPBES to help you be more responsible in your supply chains? First, the companies, maybe?
Yeah. So as part of an industry-wide approach, we welcome all the increasing roles that comes from a joint framework. We see a clear value of having common expectations to support a level playing field and greater harmonization. We will need to gather science and introduce new topics as we continue with our biodiversity journey. And I think the key is to make sure that we, IPBES and the brands, once again, have a close collaboration to make sure that relevant material is being prioritized and is available when needed.
Yeah, yeah, I would, oh, sorry, Jenny.
Yes, Helen.
Oh, sorry. No, I was just going to try and save time by jumping in. I agree. I think one thing I do want to make clear is I think this biodiversity journey, this focus on biodiversity, as Jenny has articulated, is a relatively new thing for many companies, and particularly in the fashion sector. And getting to grips with our supply chains and our primary producers, smallholders or large scale, whatever they may be, is a relatively new endeavor for us as a sector and individually as brands. So we're on a learning journey. So we need IPBES to keep us, helping us on that learning journey. We need the science, we need the clarity of prioritization. We need to understand what biodiversity is important, where it's important, what we need to do to help restore, protect, and we need that constantly. We've got to build, we're learning, we've got to build a narrative. We need to hear, there's an art and a science to it. The art is the communication, is simplifying the complexity so that companies understand and can relate to it and contextualize what they need to do. The science of it is keeping the complexity there and having all that in-depth knowledge, but giving us some clearer direction on what we need to focus on, and at quite granular levels in different geographies. It's an ongoing discourse, dialogue between us. It's an ongoing communication to figure out in the next very short time how we focus and prioritize our efforts through our supply chains to really optimize the opportunities for biodiversity and for people.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you. Pauline, one last question to Pauline. What would you need from your perspective on the ground with the smallholders?
I'm looking forward to the assessment, which is for private sector, which is still ongoing. But I'm especially looking forward to value proposition to the smallholders as supply chain actors. The focus normally is on the brands and the companies, what they can do. But just like how the indigenous communities have been incorporated, their voices have been incorporated into the other assessments, an effort to incorporate the voices of the supply chain actors, particularly the smallholders, would be very useful in the assessment. And also breaking down the language and making it more palatable, more compatible with them, more practical within their perspective will be very welcome in the assessments. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Pauline. So I confirm IPBES will further assist businesses with assessing their impacts and dependence on biodiversity. Thanks to this forthcoming methodological assessment Pauline just mentioned, it will propose indicators for measuring and monitoring that dependence and impact. So IPBES will provide further guidance on measuring and prioritization, responding to the wish strongly expressed by our speakers. Other topics will be addressed in upcoming assessments. I'm thinking of the transformative change assessment that will provide solutions that will be of interest to supply chain actors, or the assessment on invasive alien species, a topic that is also relevant to the textile industry because of goods transportation. So yes, IPBES will further accompany business, always with recommendations that are promoting social justice and an economic growth, including minorities and indigenous people, of course. So I don't think we have the time to pick up a question from the audience, but Helen and Pauline kindly agreed to stay after the debate to answer some of your questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A panel and mention first the name of the person who is invited to answer. Thank you for that. And thank you very much indeed to our speakers for your very valuable contributions.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Over to you, Claire.
Thank you, Sonia. And indeed, we have got a few questions that are coming in from the audience, and we're going to take them after the next session, which is also about widening engagement with business. And I think we've had a very clear message from business in that last session about how science matters and how important the IPBES assessments are to businesses like H&M and the Kering Luxury Group, and that it really helps them make decisions about what to prioritize. And as Helen was saying, they are still on a learning journey, especially about the linkages between biodiversity and the impact on lives and livelihoods. So we've heard from business about how important IPBES and the science is, but IPBES is also looking to engage business through coalitions to help inform decisions that reduce biodiversity loss. And that's what we're going to be looking at in the next session. So I'm first of all going to introduce Florence Curé from IUCN's Economic Knowledge Unit. And Florence is going to tell us about her experience of coalitions and the criteria for productive coalitions based on her experience, including a report mapping more than 200 coalitions. So Florence, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claire. Yeah, indeed, I'm going to share the highlights of a recent publication released by IUCN, which is based on the mapping of 208 global coalitions of state and non-state actors involving public, civil society, and corporate actors. These coalitions all work on themes related to natural resources and land use, with diverse impacts on biodiversity, from harmful to restorative. So the key findings. First, it is a fact that coalitions involving public actors and civil society organizations are still responsible of most commitments and projects in favor of biodiversity. These coalitions also own the expertise and the knowledge of biodiversity mechanisms. Second, despite recent initiatives, biodiversity remains poorly mainstreamed among coalitions of corporate actors in general. Most coalitions do commit to environmental sustainability, but they still focus on climate, water and waste management, with limited inclusions of biodiversity issues. Third, in this context, a specific type of coalition, which are voluntary certification schemes, create a much needed space for corporate actors and conservation NGOs to advance the sustainable use of biodiversity. So looking at gaps and challenges, we found that inclusiveness and bottom-up solutions remain relatively uncommon among global coalitions involving corporate actors. They engage more often with peers and global partners than with local communities or indigenous peoples. Then monitoring, reporting, and verification remain insufficient for most of the coalitions. So it is true that the complexity of biodiversity itself and the current lack of global science-based targets for biodiversity leave room to a number of independent standards, and such standards are not always designed to achieve a no net loss of biodiversity. Therefore, it is crucial that states adopt a shared global vision and set up science-based targets. It is a critical step to support coalitions and their members in designing their own targets and their own monitoring systems. Then coalitions and their members should mainstream biodiversity into their activities as a support to achieve their different targets with smart objectives based on international targets and efficient monitoring systems. They also need to adopt best practices in terms of impact assessment and be more transparent and inclusive towards smaller actors of the value chains, the smallholders. Last but not least, it is clear that coalitions of corporate actors could benefit from the inputs and advice of conservation experts to advance biodiversity. As such, they could offer a great space for IPBES contributors and partners to engage with business and its specific challenges and insights. Thank you. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Florence. And this seems to be a common theme across the stakeholder days about the challenges of mainstreaming biodiversity loss and making these connections on how biodiversity really contributes to people's lives and livelihoods. Well, we're now going to hear from Rijit Sengupta, who's from the Center for Sustainable Business. This is a think tank in Delhi that promotes sustainable business and how businesses integrate sustainable practices. And the center has on-the-ground experience of managing the sustainable palm oil chain in India. So Rijit, a first question for you. What did you learn from the experience of managing this sustainable palm oil supply chain? And can you share some do's and don'ts?
Thank you, Claire. At the outset, thanks to the organizers for inviting CRB to this event. Indeed, it's an absolute honor for us and me personally to be here with you. The subject of palm oil, Claire, as the IPBES Global Assessment Report 2019 underlines, the contribution of palm oil expansion towards ecosystem loss in Southeast Asia has been significant. So in 2018, CRB, together with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, RSPO, WWF India, Rainforest Alliance, launched this coalition to promote uptake of sustainable palm oil in India, and thereby really highlight how, as a consumer country, India could possibly contribute towards reducing deforestation, forest degradation, and biodiversity loss in Southeast Asian countries. Trans-jurisdictional, because especially about almost 95% of the palm oil that is consumed in India is imported from the Southeast Asian regions. So what we've been doing really is trying to stitch together a South-South sustainable commodity value chain on palm oil and to create a coalition around it. So the lessons, specifically to answer your question, primarily there are three lessons that I'd like to share with you here, given the paucity of time. The first is to appreciate, the first lesson that we learned was to appreciate the limitations of conventional supply chain or value chain sustainability strategies and methods. Some limitations of such supply chain involving certification was highlighted in the earlier panel by Pauline, for example, and we learned that the conventional method of promoting a sustainable supply chain sustainability strategy might not work in a South-South commodity value chain. So therefore, we sort of got to, we started promoting the principles of shared responsibility. It was responsibility really of all the stakeholders and not just, the northern buyers and brands trying to develop, as the driver really of the sustainability agenda. The second lesson that we learned was to expand the horizon and the idea from a narrow supply chain perspective to a more comprehensive value chain approach. And this is critical, especially when and what we did was essentially we realized that some of the solutions probably will lie outside of the limits of the supply chain and among the value chain actors. So what we did was we sort of used the systems lens to identify all those value chain actors who often were being excluded from such dialogues, but played a very important role. Civil society organizations, industry associations, financial institutions, advisors, retailers, and try to expand the boundary of the dialogue. So that's the second lesson. And the third lesson essentially was in terms of the governance of coalitions. And given that we are looking at, and we are promoting this multi-stakeholder coalition, it is critical to ensure that the coalition, the dialogue is balanced and inclusive, and to ensure that everybody's perspectives is taken into consideration, but there is no biases towards any of them, and to be very, very inclusive. And the last point really is also to continuously challenge ourselves with heightened ambitions to, because time is not on our side, as we all are aware. So what we did was this coalition was really a unique opportunity to get private sector and civil society together, something which isn't often happening, and it needs to happen much more. So the last point about do's and don'ts, if I still have a few seconds, on the do's, really, coalitions have to be purpose driven. The second is about having a very, very well laid out structure and governance. Thirdly, the importance of a committed anchor organization to play the role of a secretariat. And the fourth, the consciousness of the local context and the culture, which again was mentioned in the earlier panel. In case of the don'ts, first of all, don't raise expectations unnecessarily. Let the coalition be real. Secondly, don't copy paste blindly from methods which approaches that might have worked elsewhere. And thirdly, don't keep a narrow goal. For example, many coalitions are there to promote matchmaking for businesses. So I think I'll stop there. I must have taken up about 3 minutes. Thanks a lot, Claire. Back to you.
But really, really useful, Rijit, to have that experience from on the ground about what works and what doesn't work, and the do's and don'ts. And the audience, if you have any specific questions, please do put them in the Q&A, and I'll address them to Rijit later. So we're now going to hear from two established coalitions to find out what they're doing to widen business engagement. And I'm first going to bring in Eva Zabe, Business for Nature Executive Director Coalition, that brings together companies to combat biodiversity loss and who's working to build a coalition ahead of COP26. So Eva, how has engaging with IPBES helped your coalition of business leaders avoid or reduce biodiversity loss, which we know is such a key and urgent priority?
Thank you so much, Claire. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. So I'm Eva, leading the Business for Nature Coalition, which, for those who don't know, is a global coalition of more than 65 partner organizations, both from business, but also conservation. So the comments made earlier, I think there are cases of different organizations being able to work together with a common goal. So we have organizations like World Economic Forum, the World Business Council, ICC, national business organizations, but then also some of the world's leading conservation organizations like IUCN, WWF, the Nature Conservancy, etc. And together our aim is to unify this leading business voice to give policymakers the courage and comfort to make ambitious agreements on nature. So we've been hammering this business drumbeat, saying, creating this momentum of business leaders, which is pretty impressive. More than 800 companies now around the world are urging governments to adopt policies now to reverse nature loss in this decade. This has never been done before to get that level of evidence. We're seeing other evidence in the finance sector as well, through the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge and things like that. And so the reason IPBES is so important to our work is that, as we've heard before, it provides that credibility and scientific authority for business. So just like the IPCC equivalent, it's well respected in business. And in a way, we keep on saying there's an urgency to act, an urgency to act. In the current system and systems that business operates in, the pressure isn't as on as it should be, right? And so that's where IPBES, with all of its headline, the awareness raising, 1 million species, including elephants at risk of extinction, elevates that business leaders can't, awareness of the scale of the issue. So I think there's a real role of IPBES giving a sense of urgency, the credibility, the scientific authority, also I would say businesses are used to working with dashboards of where are we, and operating within that uncertainty. But one thing IPBES has been really good at is being able to cut through that complexity and still have a really compelling, narrative, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good in some of the analysis also, that the headline message really, really cuts through. So IPBES has been able to tell the story for business through their assessments as well. And that's vital for businesses and other stakeholders to really understand. And just one example to pick up on is, IPBES has shared how, up to, nearly $600 billion worth of annual global food production relies on direct contributions from pollinators. Then the next logical step, 16% of vertebrate pollinators are threatened with global extinction. But then the actions goes on to the actions that companies and everyone can take to then safeguard those pollinators, whether it's diversity of habitats, and companies can then relate to that logic and integrate it into their risk assessments.
Well, Eva, you've spoken very glowingly of IPBES, as have all of the speakers. Helen from Kering was saying, indeed, the Global Assessment Report of 2019 was a watershed moment for biodiversity. It perhaps came out of the shadows and was right there in the spotlight along with climate change. But Eva, what more do you think IPBES could do to help your coalition be more effective with its work with business?
Thanks. So I think further simplification and prioritization of the status of drivers of nature loss and/or for different sectors as well of society and different industry sectors. This is a duty for all of us, by the way, that we should always try to simplify and converge and prioritize somehow for different regions. It doesn't mean that the same applies everywhere, but I think that we do need to do that. I think IPBES has to continue to work with the Science Based Targets Network, with UNEP WCMC, Capitals Coalition, we'll hear from Mark in a bit, on the specific business indicators and targets. So Business for Nature is helping feed in. In fact, it was one of our recommendations to the CBD during Substat to say we need to have a process to engage non-state actors in setting these targets because they need to be actionable and implementable. Companies, if you give them the rules of the game, they can then know what their part of it is. And we need to make sure that it is impact focused, meaning how can companies make sure they're operating within planetary boundaries? So I think that IPBES has such a key role in helping that happen and the methodology for business that you're working on. But the key call is we cannot have it as a separate methodology. That will not help the business uptake. It needs to all be connected. And then finally, that IPBES continues to, at a big level, advocate as it does for that policy ambition, because increasing that policy ambition, making, for example, the CBD framework a transformative agreement that is based on science, that is setting the right rules of the game, will in turn drive even more business action on the ground.
Thank you very much, Ava, there for those points. And you were mentioning Mark Goff, who's the CEO of Capital Coalitions. That's an organization that unites the economic, social, and environmental capital interface between science and business. So Mark, welcome. And a question to you about how you see the added value of collaborating with IPBES.
Thank you very much, Claire, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here. The coalition that we are part of here is around 400 organizations now. Originally, it was about 30 or so. And at the beginning, we were set up to sort of translate the language that was in the TEEB work, so the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, translate that into a language that business could actually apply. So the great science that's out there. And I think that that relationship still now with IPBES and the wonderful work that you're doing, we're one of those translators. And just picking up on something that Eva was just saying there, the idea about simplification, I think we've got to be aware of complexity here, particularly when we're talking about biodiversity. There's a lot of complexity. And I would argue, let's not simplify this down because we lose the value of it. Let's try and make it accessible the actual complexity that's out there. As human beings, we're very capable of dealing with complex situations. So let's not simplify down biodiversity. Let's make it accessible so people can understand that complexity. One of the things that we're doing at the moment is we're bringing together all of those that have been working on biodiversity metrics over the last few years. There's been 19 new biodiversity metrics we're aware of just within our coalition that have been developed over the last few years. Everyone is trying to get on top of this. This is great. It's mushrooming at the moment, the number of different approaches here. And as that's happening, what we've got to do is we have got to make that accessible to people. So the Align project that we're running at the moment through the EU is actually taking all of those that have been involved in developing that, including the Biodiversity Protocol, the CDC Biodiversity work, and all of these others, and trying to make sure that we can build that into accounting standards. And this is how we start making it mainstream for business. So the Align project and the Transparent project that we're also running through the EU as well, those two together, Transparent and Align, they're going to be looking at standardizing those processes that puts the science that IPBES is getting out there into a practical term that businesses can then apply day in, day out in the decisions that they make. And I think I really do back up what I've heard several speakers say today. This has got to be integrated. We can't create another stream of things. This has got to be integrated into the processes that are there. We need to change those processes, but obviously we do need to make sure that actually they're evolving and we're not creating lots of competing initiatives. 19 biodiversity metrics is far too many. We need to be able to drill that down into where there's relevance and where people can pick that up and apply.
Yeah, indeed, this is a common problem, isn't it, with environmental, social and governance criteria. There are just so many, and some of them are duplicative and some of them are contradictory, and this leaves business with a real quandary, the business that do want to make the green transition, which ones to apply. And what in the future are your plans to try and ensure that the language is business friendly, or any other projects that you have, Mark, to widen the engagement and really bring this interface between policy and science and business all together and integrate them?
So one of the great things about the Capitals Coalition is that, and we're a very small team, secretariat at the beginning, middle, but actually all of the projects are run by the coalition. So this coalition of 400 organizations, and then another about 20,000 people around the world that are engaging with us every year. We did 36 different projects last year that were led by them. So UNEP WCMC is doing a lot of work at the moment. We've got the Value Balancing Alliance doing things. We've got many other organizations within the coalition that are leading these. And I think it's actually the connections between them. We bring together scientists, academic, through governments, business, finance, and there's lots of different initiatives going on. We're sort of the fulcrum in the middle. We need to see the connections between them, as well as doing these deep dives to understand each part of the system. We then also need a way to connect them up to make it into a systemic transformation. So for me, we're moving from a language of could. So all of the bits that we've been doing in the previous years have been based around we could do this, we could do that. We're now moving into a language of should. There's boundaries around that. And we're seeing that with EU regulation, legislation, the SEC in the US now bringing in things. This sort of approach, we're starting to see some of that should, but we've got to, in this next 3 to 4 years, start moving into must. And most of the businesses, I did 4 or 5 sessions yesterday with businesses. Most of those businesses were saying, we really support the regulation and the steps forward to do that. If we can have that level playing field that Eva was talking about, then we can really flourish with that. At the moment, it's about the lack of clarity around some of that that we've got to get.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to our speakers. And we've got some audience questions coming in. One from Nicole Lafrasse to Eva. Does your organization educate people in order to be certified to promote biodiversity threats within companies?
Thanks, great question. Business for Nature per se doesn't, but a number of our partners, and again, Capitals Coalition with WBCSD and IUCN and others, as an example, have developed a campaign called We Value Nature, which has a huge amount of material, training material, to make sure companies are equipped with the skills they need to be able to understand how to measure and value their impacts and dependencies on nature. So I think this is a real growth curve of companies realizing, okay, so we understand after climate, now we need to understand our broader environmental impacts and how much we rely on a healthy planet. How do we then, spread that knowledge? And it goes back to maybe what Mark, it was interesting because I was saying we should have more simplification. And Mark, you were saying more accessibility. And it's true, you don't want to oversimplify what is a very complex space. And when you think about the 1.5 degrees for climate, it comes across as something that is very simple, but actually underneath it is a lot of complexity in climate science. So I would say that accessibility is what is part of those training programs.
Just to add very briefly to that, if I may, Claire, sorry. So the We Value Nature campaign, the Capitals Coalition campaign being run by several of our organizations again within there. There is a lot of materials, there's a whole media database, there's a whole modules for getting people into this. And we just did a 10-day challenge. We had 2,500 people in there, most of them new to this topic, coming in and picking up within that new ways of starting to do this. We're inundated, particularly since the Dasgupta review in the UK and various other things that have been going on, with people wanting to pick this up, trying to understand how they might start to apply this in the work that they're doing.
Thank you. A question here for Helen from the Kering Luxury Brand Group. Helen, thank you very much for staying with us, and lots of comments in the chat saying how great it is to see representatives of the fashion industry involved in this discussion. Helen, the question for you is, the questioner would like to know if you have worked towards the issue of microplastics, microfibers in fashion and in the textile industry. Of course, there's a lot of concern about this at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I did. Hi, I was just about to leave. It's a good thing I stayed. Hi, Mark and Eva. I answered it in the chat. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is this issue really needs clarity also from you, from the scientific community, about what you recommend needs to be done at a sectoral level as well as at an individual level. There's a lot of different data floating around, pardon the pun, about this issue. And so microplastics, microfibers, that includes microplastics, we're working in, there are a couple of areas that are really important. One is in the actual supply chain, in the better management of the way products are processed and manufactured, but also way back to how do you manage that original feedstock of plastic that goes into creating yarn. That's an issue that we need to really look at a little more, as well as, of course, the use phase with consumers and customers. And there's a lot that I think we need to really get some clear recommendations also from the scientific and biodiversity community about what you recommend as I said, a sectoral approach as well as individual company approaches, and where to hone our focus on that really important issue. Thanks very much for the question.
Helen, I'm going to make the most of the fact that you're here. And there's another question from Yesenia. Yesenia is from the Indigenous Community Network and from Mexico, spoke earlier in our discussion. And she's asking, what are the challenges and needs that the business sector has for better engagement and participation with nature conservation? So basically, what do you need from the conservationists to be able to better engage?
That is such a good question. It's such a big topic. We could have a couple of hours discussion about that, but let me try and be really quick. I think it's coming back to some of the things that we've all touched on, and particularly what Mark and Eva talked about, is this complexity issue. I think companies need to understand the relevance of biodiversity to them, right? We all get, we sort of understand it at a personal level, the importance of nature to us, but what's the relevance in their particular instance, in their particular supply chain? What is the context they have to deal with respect to biodiversity? And what is it, which bits of biodiversity, but I know it's complicated, but which bits do they need to focus on in certain places? So I think that and I think that a lot of the conservation organizations are doing a great job to help build that understanding and come along with companies or help companies on this learning journey about what is biodiversity, why it's important, here's the business case, here's your opportunities if you focus on it, but also here's your priorities of where you need to focus to make a difference and to make a difference quickly. So
Helen, thank you very, very much for that. Rijit, you have your hand up, so please add your comment. Then I'm going to go to Sonia to conclude this session. Rijit.
Oh, very quickly. Thanks a lot, Claire, for giving me the opportunity. I think one of the key things also is, to understand what do we mean by capacity building. Capacity building can also be provided through the coalition, and this has been our experience as well. I mean, palm oil is not the only coalition that we work in. We work in several other multi-stakeholder sustainability coalitions. And what coalitions can do, like Helen was saying, was to create the understanding through good practices and knowledge about the interconnectedness between business and biodiversity. Whatever different businesses are, if that sharing of knowledge and information can happen, dispassionately through the coalition, then that also can develop the capacity and understanding of the wider stakeholders. You do not necessarily need a training workshop to build capacity. Capacity can also be built through that kind of a collaborative coalition, which becomes a repository of knowledge and information. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rijit. Yes, the added value of coalitions. And I think we can all see that much more time needs to be spent on addressing this issue of a widening IPBES engagement with business. So many questions from either side. Thank you to all of our speakers. But before you go off to your many other important engagements, let me just hand back to Sonia Georgiev, Head of Development at IPBES, to conclude with some of the headlines and highlights of this session. Sonia, over to you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much to all participants for the very valuable presentations you've made today. During this business session, we acknowledge the crucial role of coalitions, which are excellent intermediaries between IPBES and businesses, for they have the capacity to bring a homogeneous voice in a multi-stakeholder environment and to translate core science into policy making for the private sector. So IPBES will continue to rely on them to disseminate its recommendations to the business sphere. We noted that our coalition's counterparts expected IPBES to move forward with further accessibility and prioritization, making science more mainstream to business. So the message is well received. As far as supply chains are concerned, our speakers explained how IPBES was providing them with a framework for a science-based decision-making on sustainable sourcing. We understood how much biodiversity is strongly interlinked with their core business, as business perennity relies on nature for resources, and how important it is for companies, both for ethical and economic reasons, to progressively incorporate biodiversity into their strategies and business models. As previously mentioned, IPBES will further assist businesses with assessing their impacts and dependence on biodiversity, thanks to the forthcoming assessment that will propose indicators for measuring and monitoring that dependence and impact. The report that will involve both private sector experts and scientists will be released in early 2024. The supply chain debate involved the luxury group Kering and the fashion group H&M. IPBES entered into collaboration with both of them. IPBES has this political vision that businesses hold part of the solution to the biodiversity crisis. So we want to help them move forward, and we want them to be on board with us. So our vision is that through their commitment to IPBES work, we are going to make companies improve their practices, and We are also trying to enter into collaborations with companies that have a strong sustainability leadership in their industry, which can enable them to set the forthcoming sustainability standards for their entire industry. We are aiming to pursue this strategy with other industry sectors than the fashion sector, if possible with companies that can act as major catalysts within their own activity sector and even beyond. Among the other sectors, I'm thinking, for instance, of the financial sector that has, through its capacity to make guided investment choices, a considerable lever to help preserve biodiversity. So if you think you could be one of those companies, please do contact me. Thank you very much. Over to you, Eva or Claire.
Yes, it's my turn.
It's your turn.
My turn
Eva.
to, yes. So this is the wrap-up moment of the IPBES Stakeholder Days. We are at the end of the final session. So it was great to see so many participants and engagements at the Stakeholder Days. It was also due to the virtual format, which made it more inclusive and accessible. And I think even once we can meet in person again, which I'm looking very much forward to, we might still organize this virtual access to keep that accessibility. And as a plant ecologist, I often compare stakeholders with mycorrhiza fungi attaching to IPBES roots and increasing the space in the soil to reach out for nutrients and water, and therefore nourishing the plant, the IPBES plant. And there is also a reward for stakeholders or for mycorrhizal fungi. The plants provide sugar to the fungi. And I think we have also seen in those sessions that IPBES also helps stakeholders to improve their daily work, be it as a scientist, as an early career researcher, conservationist, ILK community, or business actor. So I think we should all profit from this IPBES learning space for everybody. And it was great to see progress in many key issues over the last few years, progress in including traditional and indigenous knowledge and engaging IPLCs in various IPBES processes and products, and also progress in mainstreaming, as we have just seen in the business sector, corporate actors thinking on transforming their supply chains, and even business leaders asking for policy change and even asking for regulations. And also progress in science, working on scenarios, on metrics, reflecting the whole complexity of biodiversity, and finally informing policy. So I would really thank everybody for these great exchange sessions. And now I would like to give the floor to Miguel from ONET and then also to Florence from IPBES, explaining the next sessions to draft a statement on behalf of these two groups. So Miguel, could you start, please?
Thank you so much, Eva. On behalf of the ONET, I would like to communicate the work and activities that will lead us to define the IPBES stakeholder opening statement today. This process had multiple stages. The first was initiated in April when we sent an email to all ONET members requesting for feedback. The initial email was followed by reminders as well as announcements made in social media that reinforced the initial invitation. The second stage in the process was set on May 31st during the Caucus Day meeting, where we invited additional ideas from ONET community and provided our guests with the opportunity to discuss and present their ideas. The facilitation team has worked over the past few days to synthesize and aggregate these ideas. To further this process over the last 3 days, almost 3 days, We cover different time zones and did an open global consultation among all the Stakeholder Day participants. The final stage of this process is today, where we will have a parallel session where we will define the final draft of the opening statement for first the open-ended network of IPBES stakeholders, ONET, and the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES. Over back to you, Eva. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. My question is, do you also want to say, Florence, something on your session? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Today will be we started our drafting of our statement in when the Stakeholders Day opened. And this is our last day for us to get together again as all of us, the IIFBES who are participating in the Stakeholders Day to come together in the Zoom.
Thanks.
So I'll see you later. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Florence and Miguel. You have seen in the chat, or you can open the chat, there are the links to the two different sessions, the ONET drafting session and the IPBES drafting session. And may I have the slide on the for the links to the stakeholder sessions, please? Because there are links to the YouTube movies of the different stakeholder sessions. I don't see the slide, but yeah, no worries. In that case, please copy the link to the discussion networking session, which is following right after this one. And with that, I would like to, and also once you click that link, you will be transformed to a waiting room. So don't panic, it will automatically start the meeting once we close this session, but we leave this session a little bit on, so for those people who didn't copy the link yet. Okay, so let me formally thank you again for these stakeholder days. I would like to thank everybody for the hard work on preparing the stakeholder days and also attending the stakeholder sessions. I think it was really great. So see you next time for the next stakeholder days or in the plenary. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.